Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I am so excited to be here today with Josh Spector, who writes a newsletter for the interested, and which is one of my favorite newsletters. It comes out Sunday at 9 a.m. Eastern, and I look forward to it every Sunday morning. It does a lot of other things. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Josh, I'm so excited for this because I've been following you for over a year now and reading all your stuff. I love what you put together. I think today, just listeners, what we want to talk about is how to create a newsletter. Josh is going to give us some advice around that because that's really an area of expertise. But before we kind of get into that segment of the show where Josh can kind of walk us through some of the nitty gritty, Josh, give us an overview of your kind of portfolio of activities, because you have a bunch of different revenue lines and a bunch of different activities going on. So just give us an overview of what you do.
Sure. So I'll set it up by saying that my newsletter, which is called For the Interested, is the engine for all of it. And I basically have sort of two broad ways that I generate revenue. One is as a consultant. I help creators, entrepreneurs, consultants essentially grow their audience and business. So that could mean attracting clients. That could mean selling products. It could be securing opportunities. It's sort of different for everyone. But I help them with sort of strategic ways to use content, use newsletters, use social media to basically accomplish their goals. Then separate from that, I also have my own sort of creations that I monetize. So my newsletter, which I monetize through ads. I create courses. I have info products. So a variety of sort of more scale. I work as an independent consultant myself. So on the consulting side, I can only work with so many people. I can only charge so much. There's sort of a ceiling to it. On the non-consulting side, that's sort of infinitely scalable because in theory, I can sell a course to as many people as I want. I can continue to grow my newsletter and charge more for ads. So I sort of have those two buckets of kind of scalable and non-scalable revenue. But that said, the newsletter, my newsletter, which I've written now I publish it every week for like almost 6 years now. And I also have a daily edition that's a 1-paragraph newsletter every day. We can talk about that as well. But basically, that newsletter is the engine of my entire business. So as a consultant, almost all of my clients come through that newsletter. It's all sort of inbound. I don't do any outreach for clients. I have a waiting list. And, I'm a huge proponent of newsletters, especially for your audience and consultants, because I think it's just an incredible way to sort of attract clients to you, maintain relationships with people you've already worked with, and really sort of establish yourself as a leader in your space.
Tell us a bit about the courses that you've created, maybe just list a few of them, and we'll include a link in the show notes to these, and tell us about some of the different info products that you sell.
Sure. So I have a newsletter course about how to sort of launch and grow your newsletter called the Newsletter Accelerator. People can see that at newslettercreators.com. Then I have a paid newsletter sort of collection of resources called This Is How I Do It. And that is every week. It's an annual subscription. And every week you basically get a deep dive behind the scenes of how I do something to grow my audience and business. And the archives now probably have about 65 resources in there. So it's everything from here's how I write a sales page to here's how I do email outreach to here's how I negotiate with clients to here's how I use Twitter, all of that kind of stuff. Then I have some sort of various one-off products. Like the most recent one is a video presentation I put out called 80-Minute Social Media Mastery. And it's just an 80-minute presentation where I sort of take people through how to actually use social media in an effective way to get what they want, as opposed to sort of wasting a bunch of time and effort on it like lots of people do. So it's a variety of products, but that sort of gives you an idea of the scope.
All right, fantastic. Tell us a bit more about your consulting business. So if you're maybe walk us through an example of how you would work with an individual. And I think that you told me that you work mainly on the strategy, helping them figure out
Yep.
what the content is going to look like and who the audience is and how often it's going to go out, not so much on helping them actually execute and write the stuff on an ongoing basis. But walk me through what it is you would do with someone in an engagement.
Sure. So why don't we do a sort of specific hypothetical? Why don't you know your audience obviously better than me. So give me a sort of hypothetical person who might be listening, and I'll sort of tell you what my kind of pitch or offering to them would be.
All right, sure. So let's take a consultant who perhaps is a former engagement manager at McKinsey and primarily serves the life sciences industry. So they, consult to pharma companies, and maybe they occasionally do a medical device company. And they're not interested in selling any products. They're mainly interested in getting sort of consulting projects that might be 2-3 months at a time kind of thing. So that's mainly what they're looking for. They're not looking to sell like an hour at a time here or there.
Yeah, perfect. So the first thing I would say is there's sort of two ways that I offer or package up my consulting services at the moment. So one is what I call a clarity call. And what that is it's a 90-minute call where that person would send me sort of all the background information about where they're at. I would sort of review that. Then we would get on the call, and I have this framework where I would sort of walk them through a series of questions, and together they would come out of it with this specific sort of plan and clarity about how to position themselves, how to message themselves, who the audience is they need to reach, and sort of topics that they could create content about. And when I say content, that could be newsletter, social media, white paper. It could be, I'm using content in a very podcast. I'm using content in a very broad sense. But one of the things I found is one of the things that really hold people back is they lack sort of clarity. They're very vague about what they want and who they need to reach. So these clarity calls are essentially in 90 minutes, they come out and actually we create a document on the call together. They come out with clarity about messaging, marketing, positioning, who they're trying to reach, how to provide value and attract those people, which makes everything else easier, right? So that would be one option. That's the clarity call. The other option would start with the clarity call and would expand into basically a 4 to 6 week engagement where together we would flesh out a full sort of custom strategy plan for them. So we'd have a couple more calls. I would wind up putting together, it's usually like a 30 to 40 page document with a full on sort of playbook for them to follow. And depending on the situation, some of that could include copy and stuff that I would write for them. So for example, I might give them recommendations for their social bios. I might give them recommended copy for their website or for their sales, their about page, or how to sort of talk about their services or what they package up. So that's what I call a custom strategy plan. And that's, again, usually like a 4 to 6 week engagement. So those are sort of the two packages that I would offer. But either way, where it would start in my conversation with this person is I would say, look, let's talk about what you're trying to accomplish. Newsletters, social media content, all of that is not a goal itself. It's a tool you use to accomplish a goal. And I think this is where people get really confused and also get really frustrated and feel like they're spinning their wheels and it's a waste of time. Like, the goal is not to get likes or engagement or any of that, right? The goal is to use this stuff to accomplish what you want. So in this scenario, it's to get a certain type of client ultimately. Like, that's why you're doing this, right? You could post photos, you could post funny photos of your cat and get lots of likes, but that's not going to get you clients, right? So you want to start with what you're trying to accomplish and then create a strategy specifically aligned to do that. And one of the examples I use is I've done a lot of work with comedians over the years, and I would have a conversation with a comedian and I'd ask them, what's your goal? And they'd say, oh, I want more followers. And I'd say what I just said to you, that's not a goal. Like, what are you actually trying to accomplish? And they might say, oh, well, I want to get, ultimately I want to get cast on a sitcom. I said, okay, perfect. What do you think is going to get you closer to being cast on a sitcom? Having 15,000 random people following you, or having 50 casting directors and showrunners follow you, right? Obviously, it's casting directors and showrunners. So you need a social strategy or a content strategy that's going to attract them, which is way different than attracting 15,000 random people, right? So in the case of the hypothetical we're doing here, if their goal is to get sort of life sciences clients, they need to figure out what do those people value and how can I create a newsletter or content or whatever it may be that's going to attract them and ultimately make them want to hire me. So that's sort of a crash course in sort of how I approach all of this.
All right, great. So let's talk about some of the how-to on the newsletter. Maybe we start with that kind of, and most of the audience listening now, is probably looking for consulting projects. Typically, it might be anywhere from 2 or 3 weeks to 2 or 3 months, kind of a thing. So they want to keep in touch with potentially. Some people might send this to existing clients or past clients just to stay top of mind. Although it'd be great to also be able to find potential clients that want to receive it. What are some things around the? So I think we understand what the goal is. To actually get at least at bats for consulting projects. To get into consideration set.
Yep.
What are some of your? And maybe in this conversation we could think through content. How do you think about content? And then we can go into some of the practical factors of your recommendations on how do you actually do signups for it? What are the best technologies to send it? Any tips you have on design and frequency and so forth. But let's start with the content. Like, what are some different content options that, in our scenario, that you might recommend the person think about exploring?
Okay. So let's start with this, and I'm going to talk about newsletters specifically, although a lot of this can also apply to sort of other stuff. The first thing to understand is that all a newsletter is a value delivery mechanism. Right? So your goal is to deliver specific value to the specific audience that you need to reach and want to reach to accomplish your goal. Your newsletter is not about you. And I think this is where a lot of people get it wrong, right? Nobody cares about the updates of what you're doing. Like, that's not the point. And even down to the naming of your newsletter, I think it's a big mistake to name, it's not the Josh Spector newsletter, right? You want the name. So if we'll stick with this hypothetical, right? If I'm going after life sciences clients and I need to reach life sciences executives or marketers or, biz dev people or whoever the sort of specific target is, I want to create a newsletter that with the very name of the newsletter is a no-brainer for those people to subscribe, even if they have no idea who I am. Because part of what you're trying to do is, I assume, it may be different for some people, but in most cases, assuming you're trying to attract new potential clients, they don't know who you are. So they don't care about the Josh newsletter, but they would really care about the life science biz dev newsletter. I'm making it up.
Right. Yeah.
But so when you think about it like that it's not about you, it's about them. And you go, okay, what's an email that I could send once a week, once every 2 weeks, that someone that worked at one of these life sciences companies would find valuable, useful, and would be an absolute no-brainer for them to subscribe to if they were aware of it, right? And so that can be content you create, but it also can be content you curate, right? And it can be simple. This is the other thing. All a newsletter has to be is valuable. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be a fancy design. You get my daily newsletter, which sometimes is literally just a sentence. It may be a sentence with a link, but if that sentence and link is valuable to my audience, they're going to love it. And they're actually going to love that it's short and simple. Nobody wants to read a novel about your thoughts on something, right? Not that you can't be sharing that, and I'm not saying not to ever do that, but I think one of the reasons why people don't do newsletters is because they have an assumption about what it needs to be, and that it's complicated and that it's hard. Even if you're someone who posts on LinkedIn, if you can post on LinkedIn, you could have a newsletter. Take the same stuff and just put it in email form. And by the way, with that, you're going to reach more people, because emails are, newsletters and emails are algorithm proof. When you're posting on these social channels, a small percentage of your audience sees them, whereas just about everybody who subscribes to your newsletter is going to get it by email. So that would be the first thing. I would think about it that way. And once you start thinking about it from that perspective, it's not that hard to figure out how to provide value to people. It's hard when people create newsletters and they're just promoting themselves, right? Because no one cares about that. People who don't know you certainly don't care. And people who do know you don't want an email every week with you basically suggesting that they hire you, right? So everything becomes rooted in, these are the specific people I need to reach. How can I provide them value on a consistent basis?
So you could do things, and I love yours. Yours are short, right? So
Yep.
your weekly email, it's just 5 items typically, and
Yep.
even your ads are interesting. So people could do something like 5 curated links to interesting articles in that
Yep.
particular therapeutic area, or it could
Yep.
be, you might even engage an offshore research firm to do some of the legwork, and then send out something like, hey, here's the 10 pharma deals this week that were
Yep.
announced, or here's 5 product moves or something that happened.
Yep.
So if it's something
Yeah,
that
no,
comes,
I'll give you a specific example. Like, also, a simple Google search and Google News search, you can just find stuff that those people are going to be interested in. So I have a client who I helped on. They work in the alarm industry, and their target audience is basically all these kind of alarm store alarm owners and salespeople and that kind of thing, right? It's a very niche thing. I know nothing I know nothing about it prior to working with them. But literally, you can go on Google, do a Google News search, because you'll get the most recent stuff, as opposed to a regular Google search, which will be, forever, timeless stuff. Do a Google News search each week for a specific topic in that niche, and you'll see what's out there. And every week we find multiple things. This company launched this product, or here's a way, here's a story about someone who the alarm saved their life, and whatever. And you just find stuff that's going to be relevant and interesting to that audience, and write a 1 or 2 sentence summary and share the link. But to those people, that's really valuable, because they probably didn't see it. You're doing the work for them. And once you're attracting them, once you create something that's providing that value, and this is the alarm companies is a perfect example, right? Their newsletter has grown because within that industry, those people are telling other people, oh, you should, there's this newsletter that shares with me stuff that's exactly about our industry, right? So if you take the life sciences thing again, once you create that, you're building a system that's going to draw people to you, which is never going to happen if you're just sending, the Josh newsletter talking about how great my stuff is.
That's very valuable. Give us 2 or 3 other examples of clients of yours, and you can sanitize it, but like of the types of content that they are sending out.
So I had a client who he works his target audience is basically people who speak Chinese but are not native Chinese. Like, they do a lot of business in China, right? So they already speak the language. They're sort of intermediate to advanced, but language is always evolving and slang. And so their interest is, how do I sort of stay up to date with Chinese language and understand the sort of nuances, so when I'm doing business with people there, I know what they're talking about, right? So he launched a newsletter that's designed to basically help those people stay up to date with the latest in the Chinese language. So he does that by sharing various interviews and videos, and so, of people in China talking about and explaining, like, oh, this is a phrase that's becoming popular there, and here's what it means, and here's how to use it. And then he also shares various sort of idioms and stuff, like, super valuable. It's a very specific niche audience, but to those people, that's really valuable. Now, he's ultimately building a business around that. It's not about consulting, but the principles are the same. I have another client who, actually, this is probably an even more accurate description. So she was a professor at Oxford, who specialized in, like, persuasive writing, and she's now transitioning into consulting and wants to help political campaigns and sort of become a speechwriter and help with sort of political messaging for nonprofit organizations and that kind of thing, right? So, I worked with her to develop a newsletter that's going to attract those people, right? So she's going to be sharing things about how to use your writing to do things like fundraising, to get people to take action, to, packaging up her expertise and finding the expertise of others that's out there on that topic, so that so that if you are let's say, a political campaign manager, this newsletter is a no-brainer to subscribe to. And once she's building that relationship with them, and she's able to slip in some of her own advice and that kind of thing, ultimately that's going to lead to them hiring her when they need help.
Love it. Okay, so
one other note about that too. The other piece of this is, when you run a newsletter, you can see who clicks what links. So that, from a getting clients perspective, is fascinating, right? So, for example, like, let's do the life sciences one, right? If you shared an article that you wrote or that you found somewhere that was about, let's say, what to do when you think people don't understand your pharma product, let's say, right? You could look at the stats, and anyone that clicked that link, they're at least curious and unsure if people understand their pharma product, right? So that becomes super valuable lead gen information, because now when you're reaching out to pitch that company or that person down the road, they're at least thinking about that, right? So you can shape your pitch to that, right? Hey, they don't know that that, but because you can pay attention to who clicks what, right? If one of your subscribers clicks a link about wanting to expand their biz dev team, for example, right? An article about how to grow your biz dev team, they're thinking about spending money to expand their biz dev team. That's super valuable information in terms of a sort of lead generation, client pitching perspective.
What frequency do you recommend on newsletters?
So ultimately, pick a frequency that you can stick with and consistently send at the same time and day. So if you can only do monthly, do monthly. Don't say I'm going to do weekly and then be skipping weeks all the time. That said, your goal is to become a habit for readers. So I think you can only really become a habit if you send at least once every 2 weeks. Ideally, I would say weekly. But either weekly or once every 2 weeks is typically what I recommend. Although it's not the end of the world. Like, if you do monthly, it's better than nothing. But your goal is to become a habit for readers, which is also why it's really important to, whatever you choose, send at the same time every time, because otherwise you'll never become a habit.
A lot of this sounds like a lot of work. For example, the alarm company researching all those news, doing it at Google News. Talk to me about any of your clients who end up kind of outsourcing this and finding some kind of research person to compile a lot of the work. Any advice
So
around doing that?
yeah, so I would say a couple things. So number one, once you have this sort of strategy in place and know what you're doing or trying to do, it's actually not as much work as it may sound like. The truth is, doing those Google News searches, it takes 10 minutes basically. Like, you search for a couple terms, you see what came out this week, you pick one or two of them, and you write like a 1 or 2 sentence summary. So it's not as complicated as it sounds. That said, again, once you sort of have the basics of it, like that alarm company outsources the production of the newsletter, they hire someone to do it. They sort of just oversee it because they have industry expertise that person doesn't, because it's a very niche industry. But that person does the writing and the scheduling and the sending, so they don't have to deal with any of that. Once you have what you're trying to do, it's not that hard to hire, or have a low level assistant at your company or whatever, hire someone to just put together the newsletter for you. And you just sort of oversee what's going into it. And even if you don't want to choose the stuff, you could have that person, say, hey, here's 10 things that might work for, you can have them do the Google searching or whatever. Here's 10 articles that might work. What do you like? And they say, oh, I like these 3. And then they go off and write it. The other thing that I would say is, depending on your niche and depending on what you do and how you approach it, it doesn't have to be new stuff, which from a time standpoint, so let's go back to the life sciences thing, right? You could figure out the people in that position need X, Y, and Z, or would value X, Y, and Z information. And not all of that is news, right? So even in the alarm example, the alarm industry newsletter example, we will do stuff like, so customer service is a big part of their thing. So we will find articles that are basically timeless about how to deal with customer complaint calls, right? Well, that kind of stuff could be banked way in advance. So like they have multiple issues planned out in advance with sort of timeless content, and then just drop 1 or 2 new things that happened into it, right? So I think that's another piece where, whether you outsource it or do it yourself, it doesn't have to be this grind, because you can find a lot of stuff that is timeless and map it out way in advance. Even my daily newsletter, for example, I have weeks scheduled in advance, because I'm not covering news. If I'm sharing an interesting story about Paul McCartney's creative process, it doesn't matter if I send that now or 3 months from now. So I think that's another sort of piece of this that makes it easier to do than people may realize.
Tell me about your recommendations around technology tools for sending. So MailChimp, Constant Contact, other tools. How should people actually physically, send out the newsletter?
So there's a million different email service providers at this point. I get this question all the time. People get sort of paralyzed by the choice. The truth of the matter is, they're all basically the same, and it doesn't really matter. They'll all work. It's the least important choice or decision of anything you're going to do with a newsletter. So I would say, all of the ones you mentioned, MailChimp, ConvertKit, Aweber, like, they're all fine. I would just say, pick one and start doing it. If at some point you don't like it, you can always switch. But to be honest, they're all going to be fine for what people are doing. But what I would say is, simple is better. Like my newsletter literally just has an image at the top. There's no fancy template. There's no fancy design. None of that stuff matters. And in some ways it can actually hurt you. Like, the more images you put in, the more complicated not only to create, but it can wind up being more likely to get flagged as spam. Like, my advice to people is just keep it really, really simple. Like one image or logo at the top and then some text is totally fine. Like I think people get paralyzed and scared because they think, oh, I need to get a template designed and I need to, what platform do I use? And like none of that stuff really matters. And in some ways, especially from an individual consultant person, you don't want it to, you want it to feel like it's coming from a person. You don't want it to feel like it's some, you actually don't want it to feel like like a marketing or sales email. Oh, one other note I should say that I didn't mention before. So while I do recommend naming the newsletter not after yourself, like mine is the For the Interested newsletter, not the Josh Spector newsletter. At the same time, I recommend that you send it from an email that is you. So the email comes from Josh Spector, even though the newsletter is named For the Interested. And the reason for that, especially for independent consultants, is ultimately you want people to feel connected to you. You want it to feel personal. And so eventually it sort of becomes synonymous that they know, like for me, people know it's the For the Interested newsletter, but they know it's me, right? It's not some company, because ultimately I want them to hire me. And so I think that's the same for independent consultants. The newsletter name is designed to attract people who may not know who you are, but the email that you're sending from is designed to then get those people to know who you are.
What are your tips around just the mechanics of having a sign up for it in terms of on your website or wherever
Yep.
to make it easy for people to afford it? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you should definitely have a sign up page on your website. When you describe it, this is the other key. You want to play up the benefits, not the features, right? So what you want to do is you want the sign up, the copy on the sign up page should be explaining the value they're going to get out of it, not so in the life, let's say it's the life science business newsletter or whatever. That copy should say something along the lines of, sign up to get tips and tricks you can use to make your life sciences business grow or something like that, right? What it shouldn't be is, a weekly collection of 5 links from Josh about whatever, right? That's describing what it is. You want to focus on the value they're going to get from it.
Mm. And then what about any tips around just encouraging people to forward it to others and making that easy and obvious to do?
Yeah, I mean, you can always reference it. Like at mine at the bottom, I say, if you liked it, share it and people can subscribe here. But for the most part, like that'll kind of happen. The other thing I would say about all this is it's not a short game. Like when, it's gonna take time, but that's fine. And to just sort of be patient with it and, set, like one of the things I tell people a lot is, when you start out, pick a set number of issues that you're going to send and don't even worry about how it's performing until you hit that number, right? So that people fall into the trap of, oh, I sent 2 issues and I'm not getting new subscribers and 3 people unsubscribed and maybe this isn't working. Like it's much better to go, I'm going to send this once every 2 weeks for the next 6 months. And at the end of that, I'll assess how it's going and whatever, because as you go, not only you're going to get better at it, you're going to be able to start gauging, wow, when I share this kind of stuff, lots of people click it. When I share this kind of stuff, lots of people reply. Oh, when I did that, someone reached out about hiring me. You're going to get better at it and you're also going to get faster and it's going to get easier to create. So I think in general, you want to go into it with a bit of a commitment so that you're not every issue trying to figure out whether or not it's working.
Do you recommend having an archive of back issues on a website somewhere so people can go back to look at the old ones? Or
yeah, I mean, you don't absolutely have to, but I do, if you can, I do think it's worth it. And I think that's the other thing too that people don't realize is, a newsletter can be an engine for all your stuff. So if you create it in a way that's sort of modular, like let's say you do like kind of 5 summaries and links, that could also be 5 social posts. You can repurpose all the stuff that you put in your newsletter. So the time that you're investing in your newsletter may actually be the same time you're investing in like LinkedIn content, for example, right? You're just switching up the order. So I think you can get a lot more value out of what you're doing. And by the way, I should also add, and vice versa, right? Your newsletter might just be you taking the three, let's say you're somebody who posts on LinkedIn once a day. Well, your newsletter might just be you taking the 3 posts that did the best on LinkedIn and repurposing them in your newsletter. Because again, most people didn't see them. So that sort of overlap, you don't need to be adding sort of more work or content creation. You can be repurposing stuff, either newsletter to social or social to newsletter.
How about your first issue? So, you haven't had any signups yet. So do you ask people, do you want to receive my newsletter? How do you get the initial people to sign up?
So a couple things. So most people probably have, even if you don't have a formal email list, like you have emails of people you've worked with, former clients or colleagues or whatever. This is also where it's super helpful if you're, going after a specific niche. And, it's a lot different to say, hey, I'm starting this thing where I'm going to share stuff to, help people grow their life sciences business, is really different than going like, hey, you want to get the Will newsletter? Right. So you can just email them and say, one thing you may want to do is with that, in terms of people, you can say, hey, just go here and sign up if you want it. But what I would actually recommend is say, hey, I thought you might like it. I'll send it to you if you want to check it out. Just let me know. Like, make it as easy as possible for them to say yes. Don't even force them to go to a page and sign up. Let them just reply and say, yeah, sure, cool. Right. And then you just add them to your list. So that's one thing you can do with people that you know. But yeah, that's where you start. And I think also you can then, once you send it to those people that like it, or most likely people, some of them will reply and say, oh, that was really cool, thanks, whatever. Don't be afraid to ask them and say, hey, if you know anyone who would like it, share it, right? And again, with all this stuff, make it as easy as possible. Give them the link, say, hey, you could post on LinkedIn and tell people about it and send them here. And you sort of grow from there.
Fantastic. What any other tips that I haven't asked you about to, as people think about, creating this newsletter, sending it regularly, to your point, around the same time and time each week. Any other things we haven't covered?
I guess I'll give a couple sort of simple, besides the sort of curated content, some simple kind of original content ideas. Any question that you're ever asked, and certainly if you're a consultant, you run into the same questions and the same problems over and over again. Any question that you're asked, the answer to it is a great piece of content. So one of the simplest ways to come up with content ideas is literally just make a list of 20 questions that you get asked the most often. And those are 20 pieces of content or social posts or whatever. And again, depending what you want to do, that could be, you just answer one. Here's the most simple thing you could possibly do, right? Make a list of those 20 questions, write up your answers to them, in a couple paragraphs for each. Have your newsletter be, each issue features your answer to one of those questions and a link to one article or video or something you found that's relevant that someone else created, right? So all you need to do is find 20 things and write 20 answers to questions that you already know the answers because you get asked them all the time. And that will give you 20 issues of your newsletter, which if you send once every 2 weeks is 10 months, I think. Not good at math, but so right there, just by doing those 2 things, you have 10 months worth of a newsletter. And that's not that difficult.
Yeah, no, that would be a pretty good start.
Yeah. And I would also add, by the way, I'm talking about writing, but I know not everybody's a writer. again, it's just about delivering value. So if you wanted to answer those questions in videos that you record on your phone, you could do that too, right? Just turn it on and be like, hey, okay, I'm gonna, and upload it to YouTube, and then in the newsletter you just share a link to the YouTube video. So again, I think people are very quick to go, a newsletter is not for me because I don't have time, or it's complicated, or I'm not a writer. But like, none of that is, you can shape it to be whatever you want as long as it's valuable.
How do you curate and how do you actually capture all these resources that you find? Do you use Evernote or some other kind of storage tool?
So it's incredibly simple. I use this thing called Workflowy, which is literally just like it's like a bullet point app, but literally you could do a Word document, you could do anything. When I come across something that I think is interesting, I just copy and paste the link. And then each week when I go to the newsletter, I go to my list of links, pick the ones that I want to share, and that's it.
Very simple. And same thing for your daily.
Yeah. Yep. And I think also for people, that's the other thing, is that once you do, well, two other things. So one is that once you start doing this, so let me back up a second. So for my newsletter, there is no time that I sit down and go, I'm going to go look to try to find stuff, right? I read a lot of newsletters. I'm on Twitter. Like, I just come across stuff. And when I come across it, I just drop the link in that list. And then when it's time to go to the newsletter, I have a bunch of links in there. So one of the things that will happen is, once you have this, you start to get in the mode where you're like, oh, that was an interesting article I read. I'll save that to sort of share in the newsletter, or that was an interesting conversation I had, or that person asked me an interesting question. Once you realize, like, oh, this is all, you just start to capture stuff that you come across. So it doesn't even take as much time as you think to quote unquote, like, go find stuff. The other thing I would say that I haven't talked about at all, actually, which, to be honest, is the most valuable part of a newsletter, even more valuable than getting clients and marketing and all that other stuff. You will learn so much that will make you so much better at your job, because you've created a system and an excuse for you to go find articles or think about the answers to questions, whatever, on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So for me, if you think about it, like, people always ask me, like, wow, how do you know all this stuff? And I'm able to pull up references to stuff. And I said, well, you have to understand that every week for 284 weeks in a row now, 5.5 years or whatever it is, I have found, read, consumed, and summarized at least 5 ideas about how to grow your audience and business. And that's not counting the ones that I came across that didn't even go in the newsletter. So that's thousands of things. Forget what I've created. That's thousands of things that I've consumed over the years. Really smart ideas from really smart people that have made me way better at my job than I would have been had I not done that.
And you're not just consuming it, but you're also consuming it in a more lean forward way, because you're planning on like, oh, should I share this? And if I share it, I have to summarize it. So you're kind of paying more attention to it. It just makes you more alert for good ideas.
Yeah, one of the things I never realized before doing this is my recall of an idea that went in the newsletter versus some other, something I read in a book or some article that didn't. It's like night and day. And I think it's because, I come across it, I read it, then I filed it away to share. When I went to go share it, I read it over again. Then I had to write to summarize it. Then I shared it. Then I saw how people interacted with it, which is also super valuable, because you start to understand there are ideas and concepts and language that I know resonates with my audience because I've seen how they react. And there's others that I know don't, because I've seen how they react when I share it through the newsletter. So as a consultant, when it comes to pitching clients and getting work, again, that is super valuable, because you're literally sort of doing market research and testing so that when you go to pitch a client, like, I know what's going to trigger them, right? Because I know oh, this person's a writer. And when I share this stuff, writers go crazy about it. Like that idea really resonated with them. So, okay, I'm going to talk to them about that, right? It's part of why my one-off consulting calls have been sort of repackaged into Clarity, because I realize clarity is a thing that a lot of my target audience feels like they struggle with. Like I know that it's resonant, and I know it's resonant in part because of the newsletter and content I put out there and been able to see the reaction to it.
Josh, this was so much fun for me because I've been such a big fan of yours, and hearing it live has been awesome. Listeners, I hope
Cool.
you enjoyed it as well. We'll include a link to sign up for Josh's newsletter in the show notes for the interested. I highly, highly recommend it. Josh, what is that link?
It's fortheinterested.com/subscribe.
Perfect.
Is where they can get the newsletter. And then my personal site that sort of kind of summarizes all the stuff that I do is joshspector.com.
All right, so a lot of courses there, some great pieces to pay for access to, and yep. I've looked at some of those myself. I think I've paid for a couple of your different pieces, which I thought were great.
Thank you.
Josh, thank you so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks. Oh, and I would just also add, if anyone, I love sort of interacting with people. So if anyone has any questions about anything, they're welcome to email me, josh@joshspector.com. And if they're interested in a clarity call or more about my consulting stuff, they can go to joshspector.com/consulting.
Perfect. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that, because if you're interested in getting some clarity yourself to help think about your own content, this sounds like a really valuable offering. Josh, thanks for joining.
Thank you.